April 18, 1942. Tokyo, Japan. Noon. The capital of the Japanese Empire basks in spring sunshine. Citizens go about their daily business with confidence. Why wouldn't they? In the 5 months since Pearl Harbor, Japan has conquered an empire. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, all fallen. The Imperial Japanese Navy controls the Pacific. Japanese soldiers are unstoppable. Victory seems inevitable. The home islands are safe, protected by thousands of miles of ocean and the most powerful carrier fleet in the world. Japan itself is untouchable. Or so everyone believes. Then the air raid sirens begin to wail. At first, people are confused. This must be a drill. Enemy aircraft can't possibly reach Japan. The nearest American base is thousands of miles away. But then they see them. Low-flying twin-engine bombers with American stars on their wings, roaring over Tokyo at rooftop height. Bombs begin to fall. Not many, just a few dozen across Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. The physical damage is minimal. 50 people killed, a few hundred buildings damaged. Nothing compared to what American and British cities had already endured. But the psychological impact? Absolutely devastating. In one audacious stroke, Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle and his 16 B-25 bomber crews shattered Japan's sense of invulnerability. They proved that the American homeland could strike back. They proved that Japan's military couldn't protect the emperor. And most importantly, they proved that America, far from being defeated, was only beginning to fight. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're covering one of World War II's most daring missions and how it changed the strategic calculus of the entire Pacific War. Hit that subscribe button because this is the story of the Doolittle Raid, the impossible mission that shocked Japan and set the stage for Midway. To understand the raid's impact, you need to understand just how desperate America's situation was in early 1942. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The surprise Japanese attack had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans dead. It was the worst military disaster in American history. But Pearl Harbor was just the beginning. What followed was a cascade of defeats that seemed unstoppable. December 10, the British battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse sunk by Japanese aircraft. The first time capital ships were sunk by air power alone while underway and defending themselves. It sent shockwaves through naval circles. December 25, Hong Kong surrendered after a brutal siege. British, Canadian, and Indian troops became prisoners. January 1942, the Japanese invaded the Philippines, pushing American and Filipino forces into a desperate defense on the Bataan Peninsula. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to evacuate to Australia, famously promising, "I shall return." March 1942. The Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia, fell to Japanese invasion. Java surrendered on March 9. The oil-rich region that Japan desperately needed was now in their hands.
400 to 500 miles of Japan, close enough for the B-25s to reach Tokyo after takeoff, but far enough to, hopefully, avoid Japanese patrols. The B-25s would take off from the carrier deck, something never attempted before with aircraft that size. They would bomb military and industrial targets in Tokyo and other cities. Then, instead of trying to return to the carrier, impossible, the B-25s couldn't land on a carrier deck, they would fly west to China, landing at Chinese airfields controlled by nationalist forces fighting Japan. It was a one-way mission. If anything went wrong, if the Chinese airfields weren't ready, if the weather was bad, if the bombers ran out of fuel, the crews would have to bail out or crash land in either Japanese-occupied China or the ocean. Volunteers were called for. Every crew stepped forward. They knew it was dangerous. They knew many of them might not survive. But the chance to strike back at Japan, to bomb Tokyo, that was worth any risk. Training began in early March 1942. The crews practiced short takeoffs, modified their aircraft to carry extra fuel, and planned their routes. Doolittle personally led the training, though at 45 he was twice the age of some of his pilots. On April 2, 1942, the USS Hornet left San Francisco Bay with 16 B-25s lashed to her deck. It was an incredible sight. Army bombers on a Navy carrier heading toward Japan. The crews didn't know their final destination yet, but they suspected. The mission was on. April 18, 1942, the USS Hornet and its escort carrier Enterprise, along with supporting ships, were approximately 650 miles east of Japan. The plan called for launching at dawn on April 19th from 400 miles out. That would give the bombers the best chance of reaching China with enough fuel. But at 7:38 a.m. on April 18th, a Japanese picket boat spotted the American task force. The Japanese vessel radioed a warning before being sunk by the American escort. The element of surprise was compromised. Japanese forces would now be on alert. And the task force was still 650 miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than planned. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the task force, had to make a decision. Turn back, abort the mission and preserve the carriers, or launch immediately, even though the extra distance meant the bombers might not have enough fuel to reach China. Halsey chose to launch. The mission was too important. American morale needed this strike. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's B-25, named Plane 1, was positioned at the back of the carrier deck for launch. The Hornet was pitching in heavy seas, her deck rising and falling 60 feet with each wave. The B-25's wings extended beyond the edge of the carrier deck on both sides. There was no room for error. Doolittle ran up his engines to full power, held the brakes, then released. The B-25 lumbered forward, picking up speed. The deck officer gave the signal. Doolittle pulled back on the yoke. The bomber left the deck just as the carrier's bow dipped into a wave. For a moment, it seemed like the B-25 would plunge into the ocean. Instead, it clawed for altitude, engines roaring, and climbed away from the carrier. It worked. Army bombers could launch from a carrier. One by one, all 16 B-25s took off successfully. It took just over an hour to launch all of them, a remarkable achievement given that this had never been attempted before. Not a single aircraft crashed on takeoff. Every crew was airborne, heading west toward Japan. The USS Hornet and Enterprise immediately turned around and headed east at maximum speed, trying to get out of range before Japanese forces could find them. They delivered the bombers. Now survival was paramount. For Doolittle and his 79 crew members in 16 aircraft, there was no turning back. They were committed. Next stop, Tokyo. The B-25s flew west at low altitude, just above the waves, to avoid detection by Japanese radar. They flew individually, not in formation, each crew navigating by their own course to their assigned targets. Around noon, they reached the Japanese coast. Some flew over fishing boats. The fishermen waved, thinking they were Japanese aircraft. The Americans waved back and kept going. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's bomber was the first over Tokyo. At 12:15 p.m. local time, they climbed to 1,500 feet and began their bombing run. Below them was the capital of the Japanese Empire, completely unprepared for attack. The air raid sirens sounded, but many Japanese civilians thought it was a drill. Some waved at the low-flying bombers, thinking they were Japanese. Then the bombs started falling. Doolittle's targets were military and industrial facilities, factories, steel mills, oil refineries, military installations. His bombardier released 4 500-pound bombs over an industrial area and an oil tank farm. They saw explosions and fires begin. Then Doolittle turned west and headed for China at maximum speed. Behind him, 15 more B-25s attacked targets across Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Each bomber carried 4 500-pound bombs or incendiary clusters. The attacks were scattered but deliberate, hitting military and industrial targets, avoiding residential areas as much as possible. The Japanese response was chaotic. Air raid sirens wailed across the cities. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but most were calibrated for high-altitude attacks. The low-flying B-25s were difficult targets. Japanese fighters scrambled, but by the time they reached altitude, the American bombers were already gone, racing west at low level. One B-25 was damaged by anti-aircraft fire, but continued flying. Another was attacked by Japanese fighters, but escaped by flying at wave-top height, where the Japanese pilots couldn't follow. Not a single B-25 was shot down over Japan. The entire raid took about 30 minutes. Then the B-25s disappeared to the west, leaving behind fires, confusion, and a shattered sense of security. For the Japanese people, it was a profound shock. Their military had promised them the home islands were safe. Yet American bombers had appeared over Tokyo in broad daylight, dropped bombs, and escaped. How was this possible? For the Japanese military, it was worse. They'd failed to protect the emperor. The imperial palace hadn't been targeted, but it could have been. The symbolism was devastating. But for the B-25 crews, the danger was just beginning. After bombing their targets, all 16 B-25s turned west and headed for China. They'd used more fuel than planned due to the early launch, and now they were in a race against their fuel gauges. The plan called for landing at Chinese airfields near the coast. Chinese nationalist forces, fighting their own war against Japanese occupation, had prepared airfields to receive the American crews. But communication was spotty, and the B-25s were arriving earlier than expected due to the dawn launch change. As darkness fell, the situation deteriorated. Weather moved in: storms, low clouds, heavy rain. The B-25s were flying on fumes, navigating by dead reckoning and terrible weather, trying to find airfields that weren't lit up for fear of Japanese attack. One by one, the bombers ran out of fuel. Doolittle's crew bailed out over China in the dark and rain. His aircraft crashed into a mountain. All 5 crew members survived, landing separately in the Chinese countryside. Doolittle, convinced the mission was a failure because they'd lost all the aircraft, thought he'd be court-martialed when he got home. 15 other B-25s faced similar fates. Some crews bailed out, others attempted crash landings. One aircraft, dangerously low on fuel, flew to the Soviet Union instead of China. The crew landed near Vladivostok and was interned for over a year. The USSR was not at war with Japan and couldn't allow American military personnel to operate from Soviet territory. 73 of the 80 airmen survived the bailouts and crash landings. They were scattered across hundreds of miles of Chinese territory, some in areas controlled by nationalist forces, others in Japanese-occupied zones. Chinese civilians and nationalist soldiers helped rescue many of the Americans. At great personal risk, the Japanese would execute entire villages suspected of helping American airmen. Chinese people hid, fed, and guided the downed airmen to safety. 8 airmen were captured by Japanese forces. 3 were executed after a show trial. 1 died of disease in captivity. 4 survived Japanese prisoner of war camps and were liberated in 1945. 2 crew members died in bailouts. 1 drowned after landing in the ocean. Another was killed when his parachute failed to open. By May 1942, most of the survivors had been retrieved and made their way back to American lines. Of the 80 men who participated in the raid, 69 returned safely, including the crew interned in the USSR. 3 were executed. 5 died from the mission itself, 2 in bailouts, 3 executed. The mission had cost 16 B-25 bombers and 11 lives, eventually, including those who died in captivity. But what did it accomplish? The physical damage from the Doolittle raid was minimal. Approximately 50 Japanese killed, a few hundred buildings damaged, some fires at industrial facilities. Nothing that significantly impacted Japan's war effort from a material standpoint. But the psychological and strategic impact was enormous. For Japanese military leadership, the raid was a catastrophic failure of homeland defense. The fact that American bombers could appear over Tokyo meant their defensive perimeter had been breached. It meant the emperor himself was vulnerable. It was a humiliation that demanded a response. For the Japanese public, the raid shattered the myth of invulnerability. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, what else might happen? The confidence that had characterized the first months of the war was replaced by anxiety. Air raid drills became serious. The war was no longer something happening far away. It had reached the home islands. For Japanese strategic planning, the raid had profound consequences. The military leadership became obsessed by preventing another carrier strike on the home islands. They needed to extend the defensive perimeter to push American carriers farther away from Japan. This obsession directly led to the Battle of Midway. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, became convinced that Japanese carriers needed to lure out and destroy the American carrier fleet once and for all. He chose Midway Atoll as bait, a target the Americans couldn't ignore, close enough to Hawaii that they'd have to defend it. We know how that turned out. Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War, with Japan losing 4 fleet carriers in a single day. The Doolittle raid didn't cause Midway directly, but it created the strategic anxiety that led to Yamamoto's decision to attack Midway before the Americans could strike Japan again. The raid also forced Japan to keep more fighters and anti-aircraft resources in the home islands. Aircraft that could have been deployed to the front lines were instead held back to defend against future raids that might not come for years. This defensive paranoia diverted resources from offensive operations. For American morale, the impact was immediate and transformative. The raid made front-page news across America. Finally, a victory. Finally, the U.S. was striking back. The pessimism and defeatism that had followed Pearl Harbor evaporated almost overnight. President Roosevelt, asked by reporters where the bombers had launched from, famously quipped, "Shangri-La," a reference to the fictional paradise in the novel Lost Horizon. The American public understood. The raid was so daring, the launch point so secret, it might as well have been from a mythical place. The Doolittle raid sent a message that resonated far beyond its military impact. That message was simple but profound. America is not defeated. America will fight back. And this is only the beginning. Consider the symbolism. 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 4 months of unrelenting defeats, American bombers appeared over Tokyo. Not in some distant future when America had rebuilt its strength, but now, immediately. The message was clear. You started this war with a surprise attack on our fleet? We're bringing a war to your home. For Japanese military planners, the raid was a wake-up call. They had fundamentally misjudged American resolve. The propaganda about American softness, about Americans lacking the warrior spirit, the Doolittle raid exposed those beliefs as dangerous fantasy. American crews had volunteered for a mission they knew was borderline suicidal. They'd launched Army bombers from a carrier deck, something that had never been done. They'd flown across hundreds of miles of ocean, attacked heavily defended targets, then flown to China, knowing they'd probably have to bail out or crash land. This wasn't the behavior of a soft, defeated nation. This was the behavior of a nation gearing up for total war. The raid also demonstrated American innovation. The idea of launching land-based bombers from carriers showed creative problem-solving. The modifications to the B-25s, the training, the logistics, all accomplished in weeks. Japan had assumed their military technology and tactics were superior. The raid suggested otherwise. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, convinced he'd failed because all his aircraft were lost, was shocked to be promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Medal of Honor. He thought he'd be court-martialed. Instead, he became a national hero. His mission was considered a complete success, not for the damage inflicted, but for what it represented. Every crew member received the Distinguished Flying Cross. They became known as Doolittle's Raiders, and their annual reunions became legendary in military circles. The last public reunion was held in 2013, when only 4 raiders remained alive. The Chinese people who helped rescue the American airmen paid a terrible price. In retaliation, Japanese forces launched the Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, killing an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians and destroying dozens of villages suspected of aiding the Americans. The raid's success came at a horrific cost, borne by Chinese civilians who'd done nothing but help downed American airmen. This dark side of the raid is often overlooked, but must always be remembered. American courage came at the price of Chinese blood. The raiders knew they were putting Chinese civilians at risk, but the strategic importance of the mission was judged to outweigh that risk. It's an uncomfortable moral calculus that war often demands. The Doolittle raid occupies a unique place in World War II history. It wasn't a major battle. It didn't sink ships or destroy armies. The physical damage was negligible. Yet its impact was profound and long-lasting. Strategically, it influenced Japanese decision-making for the rest of the war. The obsession with defending the home islands never disappeared. Resources were diverted from offensive operations to defensive preparations. The confidence that had characterized Japanese planning in early 1942 was replaced by a more cautious, reactive approach. The path to Midway and Japan's catastrophic defeat there can be traced directly to the anxiety the Doolittle raid created. Yamamoto's decision to attack Midway was driven by the need to destroy American carriers before they could strike Japan again. That decision cost Japan 4 fleet carriers and the initiative in the Pacific War. For American strategy, the raid proved that unconventional approaches could work. The idea of using carriers to strike targets beyond their normal range would be repeated many times in the Pacific War. The willingness to take calculated risks, to try innovative tactics, this became a hallmark of American operations. The raid also had immeasurable value for American morale at a critical moment. After months of defeats, the American public got to see their forces strike back. Recruiting surged, war bond sales increased. The national mood shifted from pessimistic to determined. The psychological impact on the American home front was exactly what Roosevelt had hoped for.
For the men who flew the mission, the impact lasted a lifetime. The Doolittle Raiders became one of the most celebrated groups in military history. They held annual reunions, toasting their fallen comrades with cognac from bottles specially saved for the occasion. The tradition was that when only 2 raiders remained, they would open the final bottle and toast their departed friends. In 2013, the final public reunion was held at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force. 4 raiders remained. In November 2013, they performed the final toast ceremony, marking the end of an era. The last surviving Doolittle raider, Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, died in June 2016 at age 94. With his death, the generation that had stunned Japan with their audacity passed into history. But the lesson remains. The Doolittle raid proved that determination, innovation, and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. It proved that America, far from being defeated by Pearl Harbor, was only beginning to mobilize its vast resources and fighting spirit. Japan had started the Pacific War betting that America would lose heart after a few defeats. The Doolittle raid was America's answer. We're coming for you. This is just the beginning, and we will not stop until victory is achieved. That message, delivered by 80 brave men in 16 B-25 bombers, echoed throughout the rest of the war. From Midway to Guadalcanal, from the Philippines to Iwo Jima, from Okinawa to the surrender on the USS Missouri, the Doolittle raid marked the moment when America's response to Pearl Harbor began in earnest. The Japanese had shocked America with their surprise attack. Doolittle and his raiders returned the shock with interest, and the message was received. America was not defeated. America was not giving up. America was only beginning to fight.